It was a quiet afternoon at a small town diner, the kind of place where everyone knows your name. The clinking of silverware and the low hum of conversations filled the room, but all of that changed when a pair of bikers strutted in, loud and brash. They had that intimidating air about them, the kind that turned heads and made people shift in their seats. At first, they seemed harmless enough, cracking jokes and laughing too loudly. But then their attention turned to an older man sitting alone near the window. He wasn't anyone you'd notice at first glance, just a quiet, unassuming figure in a worn leather jacket, sipping his coffee. But the bikers saw an opportunity to make him the target of their crude jokes. What they didn't know was that this wasn't just any man. He was a veteran, and what happened next would leave the entire diner in stunned silence. The older man didn't react at first. He kept his eyes on his coffee, calmly stirring it as though he hadn't heard the mocking laughter or the snide remarks aimed his way. But anyone paying attention could see the subtle tension in his posture, the way his shoulders straightened ever so slightly, or how his hand steadied the spoon with deliberate precision. The bikers, encouraged by his silence, saw it as a sign of weakness. They exchanged grins, their voices growing louder as they moved closer to his table. One of them made a show of dragging a chair, its screech echoing through the diner, before sitting down uninvited. "Hey, old man," one of them said with a smirk, leaning in like he owned the place. "What's with the jacket? You think you're some kind of tough guy." The man finally looked up. His calm, unwavering gaze was the first crack in the biker's confidence. But what he said next, that's when the atmosphere in the diner really began to shift. The man's eyes, sharp and steady, locked onto the biker across the table. "You really want to do this here?" he asked, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made the room go quiet. Conversation stopped, forks froze midair, and even the waitress behind the counter hesitated with a coffee pot in hand. The bikers exchanged a glance, the smirk faltering on one of their faces. But the louder of the two wasn't ready to back down. "Yeah, we do," he shot back, puffing out his chest. "What are you gonna do about it?" The veteran leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Do you know what this jacket stands for?" he asked, his voice steady but firm. The quieter biker shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the patches on the man's jacket. They weren't just decorations. They told the story of battles fought and sacrifices made. The tension in the room grew thick as the man continued, "I've seen things you can't even imagine. I faced men a lot tougher than you too." A nervous laugh escaped one of the bikers, but no one else was laughing. The air crackled with a mix of curiosity and unease as the man's calm confidence began to unsettle everyone. Whatever was coming next, it was clear that the bikers had picked the wrong man to mess with. The louder biker leaned forward, trying to reassert control of the moment. "You think you're scaring us with your little war stories, old man?" he sneered, though his voice carried a hint of hesitation. His partner shifted uneasily, but didn't say a word. The veteran stayed perfectly still, his gaze never wavering. "I'm not trying to scare you," the man replied, his voice low and measured. "I'm trying to give you a chance to walk away." The room was silent now, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The other diners watched with bated breath, unsure whether to intervene or stay out of it. The waitress stood frozen behind the counter, gripping her notepad tightly, her eyes darting between the bikers and the veteran. But the louder biker wasn't ready to back down. "Walk away? You think you're the boss of us?" he barked, his voice rising. He slapped the table for effect, the sound echoing through the diner. That's when the veteran slowly stood up. He wasn't a big man, but the way he moved was deliberate and commanding. The room seemed to shrink as everyone's attention locked onto him. "You don't know who you're dealing with. he said, his voice calm but carrying a quiet authority that sent a chill through the air. The louder biker faltered, his bravado cracking for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "You think you're so tough? Show me," he spat, standing up to meet the veteran's gaze. The veteran reached into his jacket, and for a split second, the entire room held its breath. What he pulled out wasn't a weapon, but something else entirely. Something that stopped the bikers in their tracks and left the room in stunned silence. The object in the veteran's hand gleamed faintly under the diner's fluorescent lights, a silver medallion, engraved with intricate details and symbols that some recognized immediately. This man wasn't just a veteran. He was someone who had earned deep respect from those who understood what that coin represented. The louder biker's confidence faltered visibly now, his eyes darting to the coin and then back to the man's unflinching gaze. But before he could say anything, the door to the diner swung open with a jingle, and two more men walked in, both wearing similar leather jackets with patches that mirrored the veterans. They weren't young, but they carried themselves with the same quiet authority, their eyes immediately scanning the scene and landing on the bikers. "You could hear?" One of them asked the veteran, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. The tension in the room spiked as the bikers exchanged nervous glances. The louder one stammered, "Devu, we were just joking around." "No harm, right?" The veteran didn't respond immediately. Instead, he held the coin between his fingers, letting it catch the light one more time. Then, without a word, he slid it back into his pocket and turned his attention back to the bikers. "You've still got a chance to walk away," he said evenly, his voice carrying a weight that made even the toughest biker hesitate. But before anyone could move, the quieter biker made a sudden, unexpected decision, one that shifted the dynamic entirely and left everyone on edge, wondering what would happen next. The quieter biker suddenly raised his hands, palms out in a gesture of surrender. "We didn't mean anything by it," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "We'll go." He tugged at his friend's arm, trying to pull him back, but the louder biker yanked his arm away, refusing to back down completely. The veteran's ally stood silently near the door, their presence alone enough to shift the balance of power in the room. The louder biker looked around, realizing he was outnumbered, and for a moment, it seemed like he might finally let it go. But then, in a last-ditch attempt to save face, he muttered under his breath, "This ain't over." The veteran stepped forward, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Oh, it's over," he said firmly. His voice carried the kind of authority that didn't leave room for argument. "And if you're smart, you'll remember today as the day you got lucky." The louder biker opened his mouth to respond, but his quieter companion had had enough. Grabbing him by the arm, he pulled him toward the exit, muttering something under his breath. Reluctantly, the louder biker allowed himself to be dragged out, shooting one last glare over his shoulder before the door slammed shut behind them. The diner let out a collective sigh of relief, and the tension in the air finally began to dissolve. The veteran returned to his seat, picking up his coffee like nothing had happened. But just as the other patrons started to settle back into their meals, the veteran's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting ever so slightly. "Everything okay?" one of his allies asked, their tone casual but alert. The veteran slid the phone into his pocket, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Yeah," he said, standing up. "But I think we might need to make a stop on the way home." And just like that, the quiet man who had commanded the room walked out of the diner with his allies, leaving behind a story the locals wouldn't forget anytime soon, and a lingering question about what might come next. As the veteran and his allies disappeared into the cool afternoon air, the diner slowly returned to life. Conversations resumed, though quieter than before, as people processed what they'd just witnessed. The waitress approached the veteran's empty table, noticing he'd left a generous tip along with a folded napkin. Curious, she opened it to find a simple message. Respect is earned, not demanded. Outside, the two bikers sat on their motorcycles in the parking lot. The quieter one lit a cigarette, his hands still trembling slightly. "You should have just let it go," he muttered to his friend, who stared ahead in silence. Inside the diner, the remaining patrons couldn't stop talking about the encounter. The story would spread quickly, about the quiet veteran who carried more strength in his presence than most could ever match. Some would call it a warning, others a lesson. But one thing was certain, no one would forget it.